Welcome to the Digital New Haven Project podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the students of the History 259 course at Southern Connecticut State University. Special thanks to our project director and professor, Dr. Jason Smith. Today we will be discussing the history of the 29th Connecticut Colored Infantry Regiment. The 29th served as a volunteer regiment for the Union Army in the Civil War. Although the 29th served bravely and well, their story has all too frequently been omitted from the historical record. However, there have been several organizations that have been successful in conducting research on and promoting the history of the 29th. Our guests today have been a part of this effort. We are grateful to have with us John Mills of the Alex Breanne Corporation and Dr. Kelly Mero of the Descendants of Connecticut's 29th Colored Regiment. The Alex Breanne Corporation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting clarity and informed context regarding the African American experience. The Descendants of Connecticut's 29th Colored Regiment is an organization founded for the purpose of honoring and recognizing the men of the 29th for their contributions to the fight for freedom during the Civil War.
All right. Well, I hope you guys are having a pleasant day, a pleasant Wednesday, July 3rd. I know it's a very busy week, so I definitely appreciate your time, everyone's time really, but especially our guests today, John Mills and Kelly Mero. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Again, I appreciate you guys coming here today for our lovely little podcast. And well, of course, just so you know, my name is Garrett for people who do not know. I am one of the co-hosts of this podcast, and my other co-host wants to introduce himself too.
Hi, I'm Brian Smith. I'm another member of Professor Smith's History 259 Digital New Haven class. And we've had the pleasure this short semester of becoming familiar with the 29th Colored Regiment, and have done some reading and read some of the work from the Descendants group that Kelly's part of, and listening to John, and so it's been really exciting. So it's exciting here to be with each of you and ask you some questions about your involvement. I guess we can start. Kelly, I'll start with you.
Okay.
Right off the top, to just basically what led to your involvement? How did you become aware of and interested in and begin to work on the history of the 29th Regiment?
Okay, sure. So my father, Harrison Mero, actually is the person responsible for us learning that we are descendants of several members of the regiment, CT 29. My father was doing his genealogy and had lived his whole life thinking he was Native American, only to find out that he had some African ancestors and that those ancestors were members of the CT 29. He took that information and he found other descendants of the CT 29, and he and his brother formed the Descendants of the CT 29 Colored Regiment. I got involved at the point when my dad started to fundraise to build the monument that is at Criscola Park today. And that was about 10 years of fundraising, and he was very diligent in that work. And my mom, my sister, and I, we supported him and my uncle as they dug deep to learn about the members and to do the fundraising. And quite honestly, I sort of stepped back a little bit. My children were young during those years. I stepped back to be a mom and work full time. And when my dad passed away in 2015, I wanted to keep the work that he had been doing with the Descendants of the Connecticut 29th going, and have been active every day since 2015.
Oh, I do have to say that I think your dad did a great job with that memorial. I don't know if you know this, but our class had the pleasure of visiting that memorial too. And we got to see some sites, learn some history about it. I especially liked just I don't know if you want to call it a photograph or not, but it was like etched into the stone. I thought that was really super cool.
Thank you.
But yeah, it was awesome to see your father's work. And so my next question would be for you, would be how has such a personal connection to the 29th motivated your work and research?
I'm very close to, had been my whole life, very close to my father and wanting to be connected to the work that he was doing, right? And so my work with the CT-29 is voluntary, right? I have a full-time job doing other things, but the work with CT-29 has turned into a full-time job because I'm passionate to keep my father's work going, but also to honor the men of the CT-29 because their stories are all not yet told. Kids don't learn about the Connecticut 20th here in New Haven Public Schools. Kids are not learning about the CT-29. Kids all over the country aren't really learning about the Civil War or even the intentions, right, of the war. There's still some Southern sympathizers to this very day who tell one story, and then you have others who tell a different story. And so my passion has led me to just keep the story of the CT-29 going, honor them as often as I can through different events throughout the year, and also remind folks that the memorial exists at Criscolo Park because it really shows the number of men who were involved in the regiment, and then it gives us an image so we could actually see two of the soldiers who fought the fight.
I agree. It's definitely a shame that we don't hear much about these all black, volunteer regiments. I believe, and you and your father's work is really helping shine a light on this as well. But, I was doing research about this, other volunteer regiments, seeing if they have their own memorials as grandiose as the one that we have in New Haven. And I think the only other one I saw was the 54th. And it's just a real shame that they're just not recognized as much as other participants in the Civil War might be, especially something, again, as close to home as the 29th. I don't live in New Haven. I live in the county in Wallingford, lovely area, but we, of course, didn't learn about that either. And I really do hope that does change one day. And I think you're really doing a good job with making that change.
Thank you. Thank you. And John Mills, who's also here today with us through his research and uncovering so many hidden secrets, right, of the CT-29. He's also helping, as well as Mike Moran at the Beinecke Law Library, at the Beinecke Library at Yale. So we've got, between your class and a few who are doing some research today, we have, a few folks doing the work, but we just need more. To your point, we need more.
I think that's a great point, and you also, this is an avocation for you and John, and with that in mind, I'd like to hear how John, how did you come to again to learn about and to be involved in the history of the 29?
Well, yeah, thank you for having me on. It's a roundabout way. I born and raised in San Diego in the 70s. My father was heavy into like the Panthers and the US organization, their message. Early in the 90s, I had a daughter, and I wanted, I was really, really dedicated to figuring out how to be the best father I could possibly be. And I realized really quickly that I was presenting in the world like white Americans were more valuable than I. And I didn't know where that came from. And I was really afraid that I was going to, work in raising my daughter and have her end in the same place. So I was trying to figure out how to stop that. And late in the 90s, my sister got me into genealogy. And so since the 90s, we've been just digging into research about our family, learning about enslaved people that we were related to that had fought in the Civil War, just deep stories that we just started telling. In 2020, right around the pandemic, I couldn't travel, so I started researching stuff in Connecticut. I hadn't really done that before, really family-based stuff. And I started finding some wild stories right here in Connecticut. Then in 2022, my youngest daughter, Alex Breanne, overdosed on fentanyl, and she was in ICU, and she was supposed to not make it. The doctors told us to pull the plug, disconnect life support. She wasn't going to survive. And it was during that time where we were making that decision, I started my nonprofit as a mechanism to continue kind of funding in some way the research I was doing, which was now in Connecticut. Happily, she actually came through and survived that ordeal. But we didn't know that at the time. So now it's more of a celebration. But as I was researching, again, it was more about the enslaved and the plight of the African American. I was researching an individual who was buried at Cove Park in Wethersfield who had been in prison there, which was where the state prison was back in the 1700s and 1800s. And I learned that that person fought in the Civil War in a Connecticut colored regiment. And I wanted to learn more about that person. I was at the state library and I was talking to an individual there, and he's like, John, have you seen the memorial in Crispuolo Park in New Haven? I said, no. And so he said, you need to go check that out. So I drove down there, and that's when I saw all the names, and it kind of intrigued me. Now I wanted to know more about the overall regiment's plight, what that was about. I realized how little I knew about Connecticut's involvement in the Civil War or the colored troops in the Civil War. And so then I just started digging into both the 29th, the overflow 30th Connecticut Colored Regiment, and the plight of the African American in the Civil War in totality. And so that's how that all started. That's how I got into that.
Well, that is definitely quite the story. And, of course, I'd like to just give my condolences for Alex Breanne, and I'm glad she made it through. And I'm just curious, you mentioned that you have a foundation for her, and I was wondering what future that foundation has, what you anticipate that foundation is going to turn into.
Well, the hope was, again, when I started it, it was like a memorial. Like we were making a decision on disconnection of life support. So it was meant to be a memorial so that the work I was already doing could now just be funded to dig into the lives of the formerly enslaved. My intent was to try to feed back to the African American population in this country the type of pride that I had gained from people that historically were not presented to us from a position of us being proud of them. In school, they would tell me about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and they would tell me about Harriet Tubman and Medgar Evers. And so there were all these exceptionalists that I was supposed to praise, but I'm not related to any of them. So they weren't telling me the mechanisms and the reasons I was supposed to be proud of the million in that 1 in a million equation. They kept telling me I was supposed to be proud of the one. And I was proud of the people I was related to because they endured, which is the only reason I exist. And I saw them as exceptional because they persisted. I saw that as strength. I saw them as kind, God-fearing people that were strong of will and mind. And so I wanted to highlight that. My goal of the organization was to find these stories and present them as exceptional stories, the average, everyday enslaved African American. That's the goal. And then to try to get other African Americans to see it that way as well. Like see them as prideful stories that they can learn from. And and then also a lot of African Americans don't know a lot about their genealogy. I think that's how it was set up. We were taught not to be that interested in our genealogy. We were taught that everybody else's genealogy is important by what they taught us in school about who was important. The dynamics of there being a lack of ability to look at certain documents because a lot of African Americans weren't documented. There's a struggle in it as well. So I think all of these things have aligned to a lot of African Americans don't have much interest in their history, their own personal genealogical history. And I wanted to change that. I wanted to find the people that they're related to today, give them their history, and then tell them why they're supposed to be proud of those people. And so that's the intent. I also didn't want to time box anything. I've seen a lot of organizations that, they do a lot of research and they'll time box it to 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and then they'll move on to the next person. And I didn't want to do that. Like I've had around 20 people, about 23 people on my list of subjects for research for the last 6 years. I'm on 3. Like I'm number 3. Like I'm not time boxing anything. I'm trying to get to the full story of who these people were, find their descendants, literally hand it back to them. And when I have that, as much of a story as I can gather, then I move on to the next person. Like put put a reasonable amount of vigor into the importance of who these people were, and not put some time bound around how long I'm gonna put time into it, and then not to be of cost to anybody, find a way to, be of service. So that's what the Alex Breanne organization is. We raise as much money as we can by just like ground roots, like fundraising, and then we use that money to do research. I trained at Boston College for genealogical studies, and I just use that training to do that. That's what we do.
That is super commendable. I love that. And I have to say that I'm assuming it is a little harder to find the genealogy, find the family lineage of colored people as opposed to, let's say, whites for, one reason or another. What methods do you use to find descendants?
Yeah, that is a technique that is absolutely very difficult. Like it's not only difficult to find the ancestor, right? It's also difficult to go the other way and then try to like align them to a current day descendant. To find the ancestor is difficult because the documentation issue. That's not just a Southern thing. That's also a Northern thing. Connecticut didn't abolish slavery until 1848. I know they started gradual emancipation in 1784, but there's a disparity between enslavement and equality in value. And even though they started a gradual abolition, even though they abolished it in 1848, these people still weren't considered equal here in the North. Like there was still racism. And so because of that, there are still difficulty with regards to documentation. A lot of research for ancestors is based on what you can find in burial documentation or from headstones or who's buried around them. A lot of these people, these graveyards were, paved over, removed all the way up until the 1970s. So it's not just like physical documentation. It's also, the rights relative to burial and maintaining burial grounds. There's a challenge in finding ancestors. So yeah, it's difficult work, but it requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of funding, because there's some things that are digitized. There's some things aren't. Some things you got to find small little municipalities that have their own mechanisms and processes for ordering documentation from them. And it could take 2-3 months just to get some of that documentation back, depending on what municipality you're in. It's just not an online thing. Some things are only at the National Archives, so you got to travel there, and you got to be willing to do it. You got to pay the money. So yeah, that's difficult from a perspective of current day descendants. Yeah, newspapers. You got to figure out who got married when. Was that actually publicized in a newspaper? Who sold what? Is that publicized in a newspaper? Right? Who died when? Is that publicized in a newspaper? And if you see that, it might list who they're related to, right, within the obituary in the newspaper. A lot of it's that, and a lot of it's old yearbooks. A lot of it's old city directories. It's a difficult thing. And then plus, because of privacy concerns, once you start getting even closer and closer to today, it gets even more and more difficult to tie people together. So yeah, there's a lot of like really savvy tactics you have to take on to like align some of these people to current day descendants. But yeah, we grind through that.
Yeah, and I'm definitely sure that, as you were saying, of course, this might not be, known as well. What you were saying, how the North wasn't as bad as the South when it came to keeping those documents, and it's a damn shame that it's taken this long for you to get some significant progress in this. And I'm glad we're finally just working in general to acknowledge the volunteer regiments, and also help those who are looking to find more information about the descendants, whether or not they did fight in the Civil War. And I was just curious, what's the best way people could get involved with your foundation, whether it be volunteering, helping you out, or whether it be you helping them find their lineage?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they can go to alexbreanne.org, and on alexbreanne.org, they can communicate and contact me directly, and I'll supply them with, this is what we're currently working on. Here are our current needs. If you don't have time, if just a donation, here's how you donate. All of that is on the alexbreanne.org website. And also, as it relates to the CT 29th, I mean, what I learned when I was digging into those folks is that it's not just the 29th, just the USCT and all colored regiments in general. They were fighting for a different reason. I hear a lot about the original regiments that were all white and about how it being about the Union and preserving the Union. And there's this idea of, everyone was kind of equal. And we had created this government that allowed for that. Even the lowest of man could vote and have some type of input into the government. And so that Union concept was what caused somebody from way up in Maine to then race to go fight. I've heard that concept, but that wasn't about equality for Black Americans. And Black Americans were fighting because they were like, I'm a man, I'm equal to you. I've got family that's being treated inappropriately and I want to protect them. That's why a lot of these Black Americans that specifically were in the U.S. in the Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment weren't even from Connecticut. A lot of them raced here from Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and left families behind. I was researching one individual. He didn't have much money. He had 3 kids and a wife. He raced out of Maryland to fight in Connecticut in the 29th because he wanted to be a part of this thing of equality for Black people. He dies in the war. I find his wife later in life, they died poor, buried in a pauper's field, even their kids. So he's leaving a family about, a broad sense of equality, and their entire family suffered because of that. And that's a common story, which is different than the white soldier, the reasons they were fighting. So, and while they were out and about, they were being faced with racism in the field, as they were being deployed. When they came back, they faced racism. The state of Connecticut wouldn't give them their right to vote, even though, 5 years later, the federal government, forces that upon Connecticut with the 15th Amendment, but the state was denying them rights. I mean, they're fighting while being oppressed. It's just I just feel like these colored regiments are supposed to be exalted in a way no other is. I think that's an issue today. I don't think anybody does that, but they should.
Certainly agree. There's definitely a lot of nuance to this. With Connecticut, of course, you'd think Connecticut would be on top of supporting those colored troops back in the day, but as you were saying, it wasn't that case. And I think that's interesting, considering that the North were, of course, the heroes, and they fought to free those slaves. And back home, you don't get a hero's welcome; you barely get anything. But I'll lead the next question to my colleague Brian.
Thanks, Garrett. So, John, you brought up the point of the history of not just the 29th, but of Black experience and slavery and the Civil War history, and how little of, for the way I was brought up, elementary education, the Civil War was presented as a finished product. 1865, everybody's free and everything's good, and we move on from there. And that's really the beginning of another story. And so your work, even more broadly with the Alex Breanne Corporation and Kelly's work with the 29th, reminds me of that. Like I was, born a few miles away. I was born in New Haven and grew up in the suburbs and never heard about a colored regiment in New Haven. That they were there. That it was just not. I guess my question for Kelly would be, so there's this whole idea of, you kind of alluded to it, the whole lost cause narrative and all that, and like the Emancipation Proclamation, the amendments, and we've moved on from slavery. And I think it's very topical today that, and I hear it sometimes from people, why are there still racial problems today? This was all settled, 150 years ago or whatever, this mindset. So, things get passed along in generations. So, Kelly, I was wondering what it was like, what was growing up, was it something that was discussed, involvement of your grandfather, and just the whole, outlook of how it was was it in your experience that, the Civil War was just, was a settled thing and there's, nothing more to see here and let's move on? Or was it something you grew up with in your family? Was it something that was discussed, and how was it treated?
Sure. So as much as my father was a historian, his job was a social worker, right? But my mother managed Afro-American studies at Yale University. And I was a latchkey kid, except for I didn't latchkey at home. I latchkeyed to her office. And in the 70s, I would have the luck and the blessing to go to my mother's office after school. I went to a Catholic school and in New Haven that is no longer St. Brendan's. And I'd go to my mother's office where I would sit with Cornell West. He was young, Toni Morrison, Skip Gates, my goodness, John Blassingame. So all these great minds of that time who were people who took deep dives into Black history, Black culture. And as a small child, I bounced through each of their offices, soaking in information from them, and was encouraged to, at that time it was encyclopedias, but was encouraged to look up different people in encyclopedias. And of course, now all these guys are, you can Google all of them and they are historical figures. But, you know, at that time, they were young professors or professors' assistants. And every single day, Monday through Friday, I had the opportunity to talk to them or listen to tapes. Malcolm X was on tape at Yale. Martin Luther King was on tape. Bell Hooks was a frequent flyer. So I had the opportunity to grow up with all these great Black minds in New Haven. Warren Kimbrough was a good friend of my dad's, right? I look at my experiences and understand that it was a blessing, but the conversations about race relations and of course the Civil War, civil rights, right? Those two different eras, but both having the same issues, even today, 159 years later, and then of course 60 years later from civil rights, Black communities are still struggling through the same plights for health and housing and employment and education. And, you know, we talk about these things in the Black community, but we are unable to do the work all by ourselves, right? So here's where the union comes together. And so far it hasn't. And, you know, to answer your question or to continue answering your question, my father encouraged us to read, and I had the pure luck of being a latchkey kid who didn't go home, but got to hang out with those great minds who are still great minds, but back then they were budding minds.
That's so interesting that you know, you had all that exposure, and you know, and I think, you know, unfortunately, not everyone, you know, Black or white, has that exposure to people discussing these issues. And it was, you know, I didn't grow up with that, certainly. You know, they might have been discussing politics or what have you. But another question, I guess, for each of you would be, so Kelly, your background is in education. And,
Yes.
you know, John, you did the genealogical research courses or whatever, but you're, I believe, is it computer science or something along those lines? So, but each of you are, I mean, no less historians than Professor Smith is a historian. And so I think it's really exciting for us, for myself as a late in life college student who's, you know, a history major now, that to get in and get your hands dirty with history can be everybody's job in a way, you know, and instead of just saying, well, they didn't teach us the whole story in school. Each of your stories and your work on this has certainly inspired me, and I think a lot of other people to get in there and to do the work and to get that message out. You know, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Turn it over to Garrett.
Certainly. So Kelly, I had a question for you. I understand that John's pretty much got it figured out, but do you know if you have any descendants or any documentation about service members, whether it's the Civil War or not, and afterwards?
My family has 4 ancestors who fought in the CT 29. One name that stands out is John Sills, and he was my father's great uncle. And I can't remember the other 3 names off the top of my head right now, but yes, we have traced direct lineage to 4 people who were in the CT 29. And of course, I have some uncles who fought in either the Korean War or World War II. we have that history there. And unfortunately, as was in 1865, when Black soldiers came home from those wars too, they weren't treated with the same level of dignity and respect as were their counterparts. There's some work to do.
Certainly agree with that. So we are running out of time, but I did have a question for both of you, and that would be, what ways can listeners contribute to the recognition and memorialization of the 29th?
I'll go first since John's still muted. I would definitely say visit the monument at Criscola Park. You know, take a peek at and look at the names. I mean, it's astounding. And look at the images. Maybe get active in either doing research on their own, or for Alex Breanne, or along with us at the Descendants of the CT-29. We have several events throughout the year, and we welcome volunteers to either help us with those events and spend some time with us, you know, and just not be afraid, right? To look at history that's different from one's own. I would say those three things.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Kelly said. One thing I would also say, going back to what Brian said, I think it's historically been a misnomer that the Civil War settled the issue. But that's a misnomer because everyone thinks slavery was the issue. The issue wasn't slavery from a Black perspective. I think the issue was equality and being equal, and the evolution away from racism and bias. That was the issue. And Lincoln wasn't even for that. I mean, he was running on a platform of anti-slavery. It was about the morals of white Americans. He even said it when he invited all the Black leaders to the White House. He told them, I think once we free you all, we should send you to South America or to Africa, because this is a white nation. Like, it really wasn't about equality for Black people. So just because they abolished slavery did not solve the issue. These were still considered second-class individuals, which is why we had so many issues through Reconstruction, which is why we had the Civil Rights Movement and had all those issues, and which is why today we still have a wealth gap, a health gap, an education gap, an incarceration gap, a leadership gap. That's why we still have those things, because we keep thinking that it was about slavery. It was never about slavery. It was about racism and bias, and trying to get minds that are still unconsciously biased to recognize that, to self-interrogate and realize they're doing that when they don't even know they are. Like, the blatant racist I can see from a mile away, but the person who thinks they're my advocate, but they're functioning in society in a way that's keeping me back, that's the real person that's the problem for me. And so this is about getting people to really understand this history, because once they really understand it, then they can get to a place to kind of get their mind to understand how this is perpetuated all the way till today, and that the Civil War wasn't an ending point for really anything relative to the core issues. I would say these people need to get deeper into understanding that, and then learn more about the 29th and these colored regiments, so they can read it in perspective, so that it can affect something today.
Certainly. And, of course, I'll definitely make sure our producer mentions those events, Kelly, in the description of our podcast. We'll mention your foundation as well, John. And of course, I did want to acknowledge that, this whole podcast is a culmination of a class at Southern Connecticut State University called Digital New Haven, where the objective of the class was researching the 29th, putting together online docs, figuring out a whole timeline for them, and ultimately it led to cleaning the graves of many of the men who were in the 29th, which, it's the first time I've ever restored a grave before. Was really satisfying seeing the before and after the grave. Our professor mentioned too that those graves will just look better and better because we gave it a special solution, non-chemical, that will just make those graves shine. I was, very happy. I'm sure my colleague Brian was happy too, to help with cleaning those graves. And you can also see the progress of just documenting not only the 29th, but other just parts of New Haven. We have a blog. It's called City of Elms. You can reach us there. cityofelms.blogspot.com, I believe, would be the link. That's not the correct link. You can always check the description as well of this podcast. And I don't know if Brian wants to add anything else to that.
Well, I would just like to again thank both Kelly and John for being with us today and for the work that you've done and are doing. And, as Garrett mentioned, that little corner of the cemetery where some of the men are buried there is kind of emblematic of the larger issue where these guys are kind of in a neglected corner of the cemetery and their story has been forgotten. But the work that you're doing and other people and that you're inspiring others to do is hopefully, we were able to clean up a few, the stones there, but as far as the larger issue, that's kind of, it was more or less symbolic of letting people know about these, learning more about our history so that we can, make some changes today that are going to help folks. So again, I thank you both.
Certainly. It's always exciting to speak with people who are active in the community and, of course, ourselves helping that community out by simply just cleaning those graves. It was a great, satisfying effort. John, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else.
No. I appreciate you guys having us on. I do appreciate any opportunity to actually present any information with regards to the stuff that, Kelly and myself are doing. So thank you. For allowing us to
Certainly.
speak.
We appreciate your time, and I hope you guys have a splendid 4th of July.
You as well.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We would like to thank our guests for their time today and for their work in promoting the continuing research and recognition of the 29th. We would like to thank Southern Connecticut State University for sponsoring this project, especially our professor and project director, Dr. Jason Smith. And of course, we would like to thank you, our listeners, for your interest and support. For more information about the Digital New Haven Project or the Connecticut 29th Regiment, please visit the City of Elms blog at cityofelms.blogspot.com, the Alex Breanne Corporation's webpage at alexbreanne.org, or the Descendants of the 29th's website, con29th.org.